My brother sent me a group text in March, addressed to the whole extended family, letting everyone know he'd taken over Mom's medical and financial decisions going forward, and that he thought it would be cleaner if he handled things directly from now on, without needing to loop me into every conversation. I read that message standing in my kitchen, coffee going cold in my hand, and I remember feeling something strange settle into my chest, not quite anger yet, more like disbelief. The particular disbelief of watching someone rewrite your role in your own family in a single sentence, sent to 23 people at once, without a private word to you first. 7 months later, that same brother called me, his voice tight in a way I had never heard from him before, asking whether there was any way I could possibly sign some paperwork for him. Quickly. That week, if possible. He had no idea, when he sent that text, that the paperwork he'd eventually need my signature for had absolutely nothing to do with our mother at all. My name is Odalise Ferrante. My brother's name is Griswold. And this is the story of the year he decided I wasn't necessary to our mother's care, and the year I learned exactly how necessary I actually was to something he'd never once thought to ask me about. I am the younger of 2 children, born 4 years after Griswold, close enough in age that we grew up genuinely close, in the ordinary, uncomplicated way siblings sometimes are before adult life starts pulling at the threads. Our father, Bertram Ferrante, worked as a regional manager for a shipping logistics company for most of his career, steady and unremarkable, the kind of provider who never made headlines but never let his family want for anything either. Our mother, Philomena, taught middle school English for over 30 years, a sharp, patient woman who could quiet a room of 8th graders with a single raised eyebrow, and who raised Griswold and me with that same calm, unshakable authority. Griswold followed a fairly traditional path into adulthood, business school, an early marriage to a woman named Perpetua that ended amicably after 6 years. A steady climb through middle management at a regional bank that eventually landed him a comfortable, if not spectacular, position as a branch operations director. He remarried 8 years ago to a warm, practical woman named Cassandra, and they settled into a life that looked, from the outside, entirely stable. My own path was less linear. I studied social work in my 20s, worked for several years in child welfare services before the emotional toll of that work eventually pushed me toward a quieter career as a hospice social worker, helping families navigate the practical and emotional realities of a loved one's final months. I never married, never had children of my own, and I think, looking back, this shaped how our extended family gradually came to perceive the two of us. Griswold was the settled one, the one with the traditional markers of adult success, marriage, homeownership, a corporate title. I was, in the gentle but persistent way families sometimes categorize their members, the one who never quite settled down, a framing that, over the years, subtly cast me as somehow less serious, less central to important family decisions. Despite the fact that my actual career involved sitting with dying people and their families through some of the hardest weeks of their lives, week after week, for over 15 years. Our father passed 6 years ago, from a sudden stroke, quickly and without much warning, and our mother, Philomena, then 71, found herself navigating widowhood for the first time in nearly 5 decades of marriage. She managed reasonably well for the first several years, staying in the family home, maintaining her independence with the kind of stubborn determination that had defined her entire life. But roughly 2 years ago, small signs began accumulating: missed medication doses, a stove left on twice within a single month, a fender bender in a parking lot that shook her confidence more than the actual damage suggested it should have. A neurological evaluation eventually confirmed what both Griswold and I had quietly begun suspecting: the early stages of vascular dementia, slow-moving but real, requiring increasingly careful oversight of her medical care and, eventually, her finances. For the first year after that diagnosis, Griswold and I handled things together, imperfectly but genuinely collaboratively. We split doctor's appointments when our schedules allowed. We researched care options together over long phone calls that sometimes ran past midnight. I brought my professional experience navigating exactly this kind of transition, having guided dozens of families through similar decisions in my hospice work, and Griswold brought his own financial expertise, understanding the practical logistics of our mother's accounts and investments in a way that came naturally from decades in banking. I want to be honest that our division of labor was not always perfectly equal, and that some of Griswold's later resentment, I now believe, had real roots in genuine imbalance, even if the way he eventually chose to address it was, in my view, deeply misguided. I lived 40 minutes from our mother. Griswold lived closer, 15 minutes away, which meant the day-to-day logistics of her care, the grocery runs, the medication check-ins, the small daily crises that dementia care produces constantly, fell more heavily on him by simple geography. I felt guilty about this imbalance often, and I tried to compensate in ways that made sense given my own skills, taking the lead on researching care facilities, sitting in on every major medical appointment I could manage, handling the emotionally difficult conversations with our mother about her diagnosis that Griswold, by his own admission, found almost unbearably hard to navigate. The rupture began, as these things often do, gradually over a series of small moments that I didn't fully register as a pattern until much later. Griswold started scheduling doctor's appointments without checking my availability first, then simply informing me afterward what had been decided. He took over primary management of our mother's checking account, which made practical sense given his banking background, but he stopped sharing regular updates about her finances the way we'd initially agreed to, becoming vague and slightly defensive whenever I asked for a general status update. I raised this pattern with him directly, once, over a difficult phone call about 4 months before the group text that would eventually formalize everything. I told him I felt increasingly shut out of decisions that affected our mother, that I wanted to remain a genuine partner in her care rather than simply being informed after the fact. He grew defensive almost immediately, telling me I didn't understand the day-to-day burden he was carrying, that it was easy for me to weigh in occasionally from a distance while he handled the constant, grinding reality of being close by. There was some truth buried in that frustration, I'll admit, but the way he expressed it felt less like an invitation to rebalance our efforts more fairly and more like a justification for consolidating control entirely. The group text arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, sent to what appeared to be our mother's entire extended contact list, aunts, uncles, cousins, even a few of her old teaching colleagues who'd remained close friends over the years. Wanted to give everyone an update. I've taken over Mom's medical and financial decisions going forward. Given the complexity of her care needs, I think it'll be cleaner if I handle things directly rather than coordinating everything through multiple family members. Appreciate everyone's understanding. We'll keep you posted on major updates. My name was not mentioned once. Not as someone stepping back by choice, not as someone still involved in a reduced capacity, simply absent entirely from a message that effectively announced, to our entire extended family, that I was no longer part of the decision-making structure around our mother's care. I called Griswold immediately, and the conversation that followed remains, even now, one of the most painful of my adult life. He was defensive from the first sentence, insisting he hadn't meant to exclude me, that he'd simply been trying to streamline communication for the extended family's benefit, that of course I could still be involved informally whenever I wanted to be. Informally, I remember repeating back to him, the word landing strangely in my mouth. Griswold, you just told 23 people I'm not part of Mom's care decisions anymore. That's not streamlining. That's removing me. He didn't have a good answer for that, though he also didn't walk back the text or send any kind of correction to the family. What followed, over the subsequent months, was a slow, painful erosion of my involvement in exactly the way that message had announced. I stopped being copied on doctors' communications. I found out about a change in our mother's medication 3 weeks after it happened, through our mother herself, confused and unable to fully explain why the change had been made. Griswold moved our mother, that summer, into a well-regarded assisted living facility, a decision I agreed with in principle, but that I learned about only after the paperwork had already been signed, the facility already selected. The decision presented to me as a fait accompli rather than a choice we'd made together. I want to describe honestly how this period felt because I think it matters for understanding everything that came afterward. It was not simply frustrating. It was a specific, deep grief layered on top of the already difficult grief of watching our mother's mind slowly recede. I had spent 15 years professionally helping other families navigate exactly this kind of transition with dignity and collaboration, and I found myself locked out of that same collaborative process in my own family, treated, increasingly, as a peripheral figure rather than an equal daughter. I considered, more than once during those months, pursuing some kind of formal legal intervention, perhaps seeking co-guardianship or at minimum insisting on being reinstated as a healthcare proxy alongside Griswold. I consulted briefly with an elder law attorney, a careful, thoughtful woman named Bettina Achterberg, who walked me through the options honestly. She told me that while I likely had grounds to challenge Griswold's unilateral consolidation of authority, doing so would almost certainly require a difficult, adversarial legal process that our mother, in her fragile cognitive state, would likely find deeply distressing if she became aware of it, which, given the nature of assisted living facility communications and family gossip, she almost certainly would. I made the difficult decision, in the end, not to pursue that path, not because I had stopped caring, but because I genuinely believed it would cause our mother more harm than good during a period when her stability mattered more than my own rightful frustration. I stepped back from the formal decision-making structure, though I never stepped back from actually visiting her, continuing my own weekly visits to the assisted living facility, sitting with her through long afternoons, reading to her from books she'd once taught to generations of 8th graders, holding her hand through the increasingly frequent moments when she couldn't quite place who I was. This is the part of the story that Griswold never fully understood was happening, because he had, in his own mind, moved on entirely from thinking of me as relevant to our mother's situation. I was still there, every single week. Quietly, without announcement, without a group text informing anyone of my continued presence. I simply kept showing up, the way I had always shown up, because that had never actually been about earning a formal title or a place in a text message. It had been about our mother. The call that changed everything came 7 months after that original text, on a Thursday evening in October, and I almost didn't answer it, given how our relationship had cooled in the months since. Griswold's voice, when I finally picked up, was tight and strained in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before, not even during the hardest weeks after our father's death. "Odalise," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I know things have been strange between us, but I really need your help." He explained, haltingly, that his company had gone through a sudden, significant restructuring, the kind of corporate consolidation that eliminates entire departments with little warning, and that his position, along with several others in his division, had been eliminated 3 weeks earlier. He had a modest severance package, but nothing that would sustain his family for long, and Cassandra's own income, from a part-time consulting practice, wasn't enough to cover their mortgage and expenses on its own. He needed, urgently, to access funds from a retirement account, one that would allow him to bridge the gap while he searched for new employment, ideally without the punishing tax penalties of a standard early withdrawal. I listened, genuinely sympathetic despite everything, waiting to understand why exactly he was calling me about this rather than a financial advisor or an attorney. What he explained next was something I had, remarkably, entirely forgotten about myself, tucked away in the far recesses of memory from over a decade earlier. 14 years ago, when our father was still alive and in good health, he had set up a family investment trust, structured with the help of a careful estate attorney, intended primarily to eventually fund things like grandchildren's education or, if needed, emergency support for either of his children during difficult periods. Because Griswold's banking career had, at the time, given him the most obvious financial expertise in the family, our father had named him as primary trustee. But our father, in a decision I genuinely don't think either of us fully appreciated at the time, had also named me as co-trustee, requiring joint signatures from both of us for any withdrawal above a certain threshold. A protective structure meant to ensure no single family member could unilaterally drain an account meant to serve the whole family's long-term interests. Griswold, apparently, had entirely forgotten about this requirement, or perhaps had simply assumed, over the years, that some earlier paperwork update had removed the joint signature requirement, given how completely he had come to think of me as peripheral to family financial matters. When he approached the trust's managing bank to arrange the withdrawal he desperately needed, he was informed, to what I gather was his genuine shock, that any withdrawal of this size required both trustees' signatures, exactly as our father had structured it 14 years earlier. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after he finished explaining, absorbing the strange, quiet irony of the situation. The brother who had, 7 months earlier, announced to our entire extended family that he no longer needed to loop me into decisions, was now calling me, urgently, because he legally could not access funds without me. "I need you to understand," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "that I know how this looks. I know what I did earlier this year with the group text, with everything since. I'm not calling to pretend that didn't happen. I'm calling because I'm genuinely scared, Odalise. We could lose the house if this doesn't come through soon, and I don't know who else to ask." I want to describe honestly what I felt in that moment, because I think the honesty matters more than a satisfying narrative arc would. I did feel, briefly, a flash of something sharp and almost vindictive, the temptation to let him sit in that fear a little longer, to make him understand fully what it felt like to need someone he'd spent months treating as unnecessary. I am not proud of that impulse, but I don't think it's dishonest to admit it existed. But underneath that flash of sharper feeling was something steadier, the same steadiness that had carried me through 15 years of hospice work, sitting with families at their most frightened and most raw. I understood, sitting there with the phone against my ear, that punishing Griswold in this moment would not actually address the real wound between us. It would simply be a different, smaller version of the same dynamic he'd created, using power over someone else's vulnerability to make a point, rather than actually repairing what had broken. "I'll look at the paperwork," I told him. "I'm not agreeing to anything yet. But send me what the bank needs, and let's talk properly, in person, not just about the withdrawal. About everything." He agreed immediately, and we met 2 days later, at a coffee shop roughly halfway between our two homes, the same kind of neutral, careful meeting ground families sometimes need when the usual comfortable spaces have become complicated. I brought Bettina Achterberg's earlier guidance with me, mentally at least, understanding clearly that I had genuine legal standing in this situation, real leverage that I could have used, if I'd chosen to, as negotiating power. I did not use it that way, not because I was incapable of holding a hard line, but because I decided, deliberately, that the outcome I actually wanted was not leverage for its own sake. It was an honest reckoning. "I'll sign the withdrawal," I told him, once we were settled with our coffee, before he'd even finished explaining the full financial picture. "I'm not going to hold your family's stability hostage over what happened with Mom's care, Griswold. That's not who I want to be, and honestly, I don't think it's who you actually are either, underneath whatever made you send that text back in March." He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "Why did you do it?" I finally asked, because I genuinely wanted to understand, not simply to relitigate the hurt. "The text. Cutting me out. I've spent 7 months trying to understand what I actually did to deserve that." He didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his voice had lost most of its earlier tightness, replaced by something that sounded, for the first time in a long while, like genuine vulnerability rather than defensiveness. "I think I was drowning," he said. "Watching Mom decline, being the one who lived closer, feeling like every decision fell on me no matter how much you tried to help from a distance. And somewhere in that drowning, it felt easier to just take full control than to keep negotiating every decision with someone else, even you. I told myself I was protecting her by simplifying things. I think, if I'm honest, I was really just trying to protect myself from feeling as overwhelmed as I actually was. And cutting you out felt like control, even though it wasn't fair to you at all. It was not a perfect explanation, and it did not undo 7 months of quiet exclusion in a single conversation. But it was, I think, the most honest thing my brother had said to me in over a year, and I found that I valued the honesty considerably more than I valued being owed a more elaborate apology. I signed the withdrawal paperwork that same week, exactly as I'd promised, without conditions attached, because I understood clearly that Griswold's family's financial stability was not something I was willing to use as a bargaining chip. Whatever hurt remained between us. But I also told him, plainly, before I signed, that I expected our mother's care decisions to return to genuine joint management going forward, not as a favor extracted from a moment of his own vulnerability, but as the actual fair arrangement our father would have wanted for both of us. He agreed, and to his credit, in the year since, he has largely honored that agreement. I am copied again on medical updates. We coordinate appointments together. He calls before making significant decisions rather than after, a small shift that has meant more to me than I think he fully understands, even now. Our mother, for her part, continues her slow decline, the particular, aching rhythm of dementia's progress that neither Griswold nor I can do anything to reverse, only accompany with as much love and patience as we can manage. She does not always know my name anymore on the harder days, but she still recognizes, I think, on some deeper level than names, the specific feeling of my hand in hers, the particular cadence of my voice reading aloud, the simple, uncomplicated fact of my continued presence, week after week, regardless of what titles or text messages did or didn't acknowledge that presence along the way. I think about that group text often, more than I think about the withdrawal paperwork itself, if I'm honest. Because the paperwork was simply the mechanism that forced an overdue conversation. The real story, the one that actually mattered, was a brother finally admitting, out loud, that excluding me had never really been about efficiency or care coordination at all. It had been about fear, dressed up as control, the way fear so often is in families under pressure. If someone who quietly wrote you out of your own family's decisions came back to you later, needing something only you could give, what would you have done? Would you have made them wait, made them feel even a fraction of what they'd made you feel? Or would you have done what I did, and given them the steadier, harder thing, not leverage, but honesty, and the quiet insistence that you finally be treated as the equal partner you'd always actually been?